Forde. I'm a PR director at BeachHut PR. Thank you very much for joining us for today's session on fake news standing out in the era of misinformation. Be sure to join the conversation online on Twitter and Facebook at Business Show Ireland, and to be sure to use the hashtag Rebooting Ireland. We are joined by two industry veterans today, both Áine, Kerr and Mark Little. Mark is the CEO and co-founder of Kinzen, formerly founder of Storyful, ran Twitter operations in Ireland and in Europe for media, and is a media veteran both as Washington correspondent, primetime and war correspondent. And Áine is the co-founder and CEO of Kinzen, a phenomenal journalist in her own right, and former managing editor of Storyful. Guys, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rich. Makes it sound really old there when you say veteran.
So tell me, we'll be jumping into disinformation and misinformation and fake news. But firstly, what is Kinzen and how are you building the human in the loop solutions for editors and tech platforms?
Mark, go for it.
Yeah, well, which is obviously what Kinzen is trying to do, is create early warning of disinformation that's affecting conversations online, communities online. So we act for our partners as kind of what we call a trusted flagger. We're watching across the internet what kind of narratives and movements are trying to promote organized campaigns of deception. Now, we look at the definitions here and we say, where is there an example of a conversation where somebody is trying to pull the wool over other people's eyes, where that might have some sort of harmful effect in society? So, for example, people promoting vaccine disinformation to try and stop people from taking the vaccine. That's a really clear example. What we do is we work at the moment primarily with trust and safety teams at the big technology companies, also content moderators, and other people who are, have a vested interest in having healthy conversations online, including public health communicators. So that's kind of the business in 2 minutes. That's about the elevator ride, I think.
And Áine, you've been, yourself and Mark have been working on this kind of stuff pre-Kinzen with Storyful. Talk us through that element, and did you know that you were actually stumbling across this big issue back then?
Yeah, I think, we've spent over a decade working in this whole world of disinformation, and we've seen traditional journalism. We've seen, with Storyful, the world's first verification news agency. We've been inside the platforms, we've come back out again. And I think that the thing that binds all of that is this mission that both of us have to, what can we do that will help promote quality news information? But what can you do then ultimately to protect people against disinformation, misinformation? And I think we all know what we're seeing now in terms of this global infodemic, in the midst of a pandemic, this moment of an information crisis. It didn't just happen March 12 months ago at the beginnings of COVID-19. It didn't happen in November 2016 with a US election. We saw this even back, the very earliest days of Storyful, where, yes, we were verifying content from around the world to be true and, telling newsrooms what they could trust based on source and location and, forensic journalism. But we also spent an awful lot of our time debunking content. And we had to use a hashtag even then of daily debunk. And what we could see even back then was that there were people trying to misuse and abuse the internet. You had people doing it for sociological, emotional, psychological reasons, but also financial reasons. And so we've seen that over all of these years continue to evolve and become more sophisticated. And while that has been happening in the modes of planting and misinformation, disinformation, we've seen ultimately then a collapse, a mistrust in a lot of our institutions, including media. And so we find ourselves, I would argue, in this moment, yes, of an information crisis, but we are now really seeing the aftermath of this wicked problem that has been brewing in the background all of these years, where you had, yes, everybody has become a publisher. Yes, our platforms have produced more and more content, faster content everywhere. And that should have been good to make the world more connected. But in the midst of all of that, we broke the connection between people and quality news and information. And there has become this vacuum. And within that vacuum, this wicked problem that, by its very definition is contradictory, it's complex. There is no one solution to solve for this mistrust and this wicked problem. But day by day, we hope and believe Kinzen plays a really important role in the detection and the disruption of disinformation, those coordinated campaigns of deception that can cause real world harm. And if we can get there early enough, you're starting to kind of have a more holistic solution to these broader problems of mistrust and disinformation in the world's ecosystem.
And just, I guess, to add on that, you know, with disinformation, there's people actually trying to make a logical argument to defraud people. But on the misinformation side, it's much easier to slip into that.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
And I think we probably all have moments over the last 12 months, you know, where we get I heard from a friend who's good friends with that friend, and that friend says X, Y, Z. And the person who's maybe sending it into your Facebook Messenger or into your WhatsApp group, they did it with good intent. You know, that is a moment of misinformation where we feel vulnerable, you know, in a moment of an information crisis, when we feel threatened and we feel anxious, what do? We seek information about the threat. And sometimes where people go to isn't necessarily a quality provider of that information and news that is verifiably true. Sometimes people find this information through social media platforms that has not been proven to be in fact true, but they share it in that moment because they believe they're helping their friends and family. They're trying to gain control of that situation. And in that moment of unintentionally sharing something, that is misinformation. There was no malice in that moment, but they have now been used by this broader system of actors, narratives, dog whistles to basically build momentum and play and really prey on people's sense of vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. And, you know, you touched on Áine, and maybe yourself and Mark could jump in. You touched on, you know, that this is going back to the days of Storyful, but it's been going around a lot longer than that. And people think there's been a massive proliferation of this over the last, you know, 4 years, but it's actually much longer than that. Can you give us an example of maybe some of the stuff that you were seeing back in Storyful days, and now what you're seeing in the Kinzen days? Because, you know, us as consumers, we're only seeing the top level stuff online or what's reported in the media, but you guys are seeing a hell of a lot more.
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to the days of Storyful. And remember, this goes back generations, right? Yeah. Hitler was using radio to promote his racist and hateful theories back in the 30s. I mean, genocide in Africa, in Rwanda in the 90s was being promoted by mass media. The difference today is scale, right? It's never been easier for people to create information. There's 500 hours a minute of video uploaded on YouTube. You know, it's incredible. So when you think the volume, right, we all lose our capacity to sort the news from the noise. And that's been the major difference. We started to see during, for example, the Arab Spring and then the Syrian civil war, the first examples of governments trying to fake things. And their intent, and I would argue people like Donald Trump and some of the dictators of the world today, they don't get, you know, they don't need to make you believe them. They just need you to distrust everything. And that's what they've done. And as a consequence of that, we've seen disinformation becoming such a global crisis because now people just can't tell what's true or not. And the bad actors out there, the people we know that are at the heart of all this, they're exploiting this for all it's worth. Every conversation, every community, it's not just the big platforms. You go onto a marketplace to buy t-shirts or books, there's people there waiting as well. So the big difference today is technology. And that for us with Kinzen has been the opportunity, because until now, there was a kind of a false choice. Like people were saying you need human beings, fact checkers to tell you what's right and wrong. But that doesn't scale, not to the scale of the challenge we have. The other people were saying, no, it's going to be machinery. We're going to build automated filters the way we stop spam or terrorism. We're going to build algorithms. And that's the answer. It's not either or. It's got to be both. And so what distinguishes and differentiates Kinzen is we firmly believe, as you mentioned earlier on, the human in the loop. That means that at every point in the process, our technology is amplifying the ability of a human being to make a really good decision all the way through the process. And in many ways, Storyful was ahead of its time. We didn't have machine learning solutions or natural language processing. Thank God we have it today. And that's really where the core of what makes Kinzen different is we're not just looking to replace human beings. We're looking to amplify, augment, and increase the effectiveness of the editorial expert who can tell the difference in disinformation in languages and markets and platforms that currently are the Wild West.
So the intersection of both of human intervention and AI is key. You think is key to the battle against this epidemic?
Yeah, I would follow up just to say that where we've got to now is this idea that we're just building the machine to replace the humans eventually. That's wrong. Human beings, from all the people we work with, in the end of the day, we have to give them superpowers. And so for example, to spot things we're very, very conscious of, we're not trying to suppress freedom of speech or stop people or take people off platforms. What we're trying to prevent is freedom of reach. Nobody has the right to expect their tweets going to be seen by 1 million people. So there's a lot of algorithms, and the business model of social media right now is amplifying things, making them viral. And we compare it a lot to the way that the coronavirus has spread. We've had super spreader events that have turned, a couple of people may have the virus, they come in contact with a lot of people, and then it becomes a national health crisis. And we see a similar thing happening with disinformation. Certain influencers, celebrities might pick up on a false story on Instagram or one of the big platforms, and then it suddenly becomes something that infects the mainstream conversation. We are trying to very surgically, very early, preemptively capture that moment before it happens, stop the super spreader event. And that's where the technology is so important, but that's also where the human judgment to spot little differences in different languages, markets, satire, for example. We need to know that someone's not saying something for a joke. So there's so much nuance here that it's an incredibly exciting moment. I feel this is kind of day one of what we call, as I say, the human and the loop machinery.
And like you've talked, but there's obviously a lot more sinister things there. And obviously you got multiple platforms popping up now, like Telegraph and Discord and everything in between. But you've got the more sinister stuff, I think, which is in the forefront of everybody's mind, which is the capital attacks and how vicious and sinister they were, and how maybe one person, the disinformer at chief, maybe instigated that. Tell us a little bit about your experience of working across that and what actors you've seen come out and how the platforms might have expanded that.
Yeah, maybe to kick us off there, like I think with disinformation, it often starts, on the anonymous web. So yeah, your platforms like 4chan, Discord, it'll then move into your semi-closed groups, think your Twitter DMs, Facebook, your WhatsApp groups, and then it's going to move even further into conspiracy communities. So think sometimes your Reddit forums, your YouTube channels, and then it's at that point it gets on to your open social networks like your Twitter, your Facebook, your Instagram. And unfortunately, sometimes at the very tip of that sphere, you see conspiracy theories then start to sometimes break through mainstream media. And that's when we then see sometimes corrections, clarifications have to happen. Thankfully, it doesn't happen that often, but you can see even how mainstream media sometimes gets played with some of these conspiracy theories. And so our job in Kinzen, I think this is a really important point, what Mark is making there, of like, again, one of the thread lines between Storyful and Kinzen is that important blend of, yes, technology can solve for parts of this, but you're always going to need expertise, human judgment at the beginning and end of the process, so that you have an expert in Germany can understand the nuances between, okay, we just had a US election in the United States where you had things like Sharpies in Arizona, you had issues over ballot boxes and these conspiracy theories, and seeing now that playbook come from the United States over to Germany this year where you have the Bundestag elections. Yes, technology can help detect and disrupt that, but you're still going to need, as Mark talks about there, that human in the loop. And so when you look to moments like US Capitol riots, like our team would have been looking at the dog whistles, the memes, the narratives, the actors, the players behind the scenes for days and weeks to kind of understand all of that and have this broader cross-platform analysis of it. So you've got humans all the time monitoring, evaluating, pumping that into our machinery so that our machine is constantly watching for patterns, for matches of, okay, let's drill in here. Okay, there is now a mention in real time of a move from the campus right up to US Capitol. What does that mean? I'm watching it in real time and alerting. We work with platforms, we work with public communicators so that sometimes they're getting ahead of these problems. Because what we're trying to do in these moments is give platforms the ability themselves to take decisions in real time based on their standards, their community policies, and it is up to them ultimately in those moments to take decisions. But the more that we can help them in advance de-risk, to have that awareness of the playbooks that are moving around the world that Mark talks about there. Because what we have seen, like a lot of our big learnings this year, is that we have seen a lot of narratives piggybacking each other. Like suddenly you have QAnon, part of an anti-vax movement over here. As Mark talked about, you have all of these positive, mindful, health, well-being initiatives on Instagram suddenly being hijacked by others, you know, hashtag Save the Children, which becomes about these broader conspiracies. And that's the blend that all the time that we're trying to kind of think about and make sure that we're really attuned to. So moments like US Capitol riots, we can be ready to help partners.
One thing you touched upon there is just that, you know, there's a top-down and there's a bottom-up form of disinformation. The first wave that we saw back in Storyful days was top-down. It was elites. You know, it was the Syrian government, and then it was the, you know, the people supporting Donald Trump. And today, those elites and sometimes corporations are spreading their disinformation downwards. The bottom-up stuff is more sinister because that's where people are, you know, most of us won't see fake news every day, right? It's not attacking all of us. It's targeted at people for some reason. They might have lost a job, or they may be disconnected, or family, or they're lonely or alienated somehow, and they get infected by these messages. They're much more open and vulnerable to them than most of us. So that bottom-up community building, January 6th, Capitol Hill riot was the perfect storm of top-down and bottom-up, right? Top-down, the Republicans, Donald Trump, go out there, stop the steal. Bottom-up, QAnon, sort of crazy things that most rational people wouldn't believe, but it was a community. It felt good for a lot of the people that turned up on the steps of the Capitol. So that's really where there's the danger. The top down, the people at the elite level exploit the insecurities of certain groups in our societies. And that is international. And that's why in some ways, looking at what happened on January 6th in the Capitol, we're always worried that people will think about this as just an American problem. It's not. It is really infecting every online conversation we're having today. Whether you're interested in, you know, as Áine says, yoga or running or exercising or buying t-shirts or buying books, somewhere someone is looking to see if they can exploit your vulnerability. And that's why the problem probably gets worse before it gets better. Now, not totally pessimistic here. There are solutions. Sure. There's a really dangerous moment right now.
And we've seen it. We've seen a lot of publications across the US in particular, who have ramped up significantly their coverage of disinformation. I've seen you guys mentioned a few times in some US publications giving your expert opinion, but we've got the likes of Donny O'Sullivan, who's out there trunching to debunk some of these stories. And I guess us as citizens, we have also a lot to do and a lot to be conscious of, but we'll jump at that in a second. I want to just briefly discuss, obviously you both have had stellar roles in these big tech platforms, and you're now, I guess, working with a lot of them on disinformation and on tools to work against disinformation and the epidemic. Did you see this coming a while? And, you know, your best place, I guess, from being working in the sector to leaving it to, you know, working with them now again. Tell us about that relationship.
I'll go first. Yeah, like I think Mark and I talk about this a lot, of how do we learn, you know, from mistakes of the past with platforms. There's sometimes inability to think about, you know, what happens if bad actors do abuse this platform. The failure sometimes to think about unintended consequences. You introduce one feature here, but how might that be misused? And constantly, I think at times, failing to think about that and all of the scenarios. So clearly there's been failures at the time. I will say, I still believe in the power of platforms and technology to do good in our world, to make us feel more connected, informed, educated. And I would love for us to realize still the power of that. I think Mark and I probably would agree, though, for that to happen, some of the fundamentals will have to change around how algorithms, recommenders are built, even how the whole advertising system operates. And we have to think more broadly. Yes, we have to hold the platforms accountable, and we need regulation in some areas for sure, but we also have to think about what is our responsibility then with quality journalism and how we elevate and support that. But while we're doing all of that, we also, as much as we, you know, for the last probably 20 minutes here, we're talking about the supply of trustworthy content and news and information, and how do we elevate the good and mitigate the bad. But we also have to think all the time, I would argue, about how the demand for it and giving people critical thinking skills so that they're seeking out quality, relevant, trustworthy news and information, and can differentiate between misinformation, disinformation, and that is something trustworthy. And if we're not thinking about it in its fulsome, holistic fashion, we're then only looking at one particular problem and constantly, and they deserve it, but constantly only picking on the platforms without looking at the broader spectrum is going to be a terrible mistake on our behalf, so I would argue.
Because they are the most, sorry, Mark, before I head.
Yeah, just pick it very briefly. Like, to be honest, let's not forget how liberating the internet has been for us. Like, when I joined Twitter, one of the reasons was I was a better journalist because of social media. You know, I was less an authority figure and more engaged with the community that I was involved in. Remembering the Arab Spring, the liberation of the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter. I mean, the power of the internet and social media for good is still untapped, I would argue. The danger was we over-indexed on freedom of speech, right? I remember at Twitter, we used to talk about the free speech wing of the free speech party. Now I do think, and again, I have a vested interest or a conflict of interest in that. I think what Twitter has done has been very progressive, and it's trying to create, to Áine's point, transparency and friction. So we will warn you if something is not quite right on the internet. That's a really positive development. We saw it from Twitter during the US elections, and I think it's going to become more and more apparent. And finally, regulation. I think everyone knows there needs to be regulation of the underlying business model and algorithms that are powering the distribution of information. A lot more openness. You can't really build an algorithm or recommendation system these days without knowing it should be open to scrutiny by expertise from outside the platform. So I do think that a lot of people that we know who are working very hard inside the platforms to reclaim the original democratic spirit are open to the idea of regulation that doesn't suppress freedom of speech and the democratic potential, but limits the power of these dark forces to hijack the democratic promise of the internet. So that's the way forward, I think.
And we've seen the both your former bosses, both in Zuckerberg and Dorsey in front of the Senate committees. Do regulators, are regulators educated enough, or do they have enough resources to I guess manage this in the short term? Because like regulation takes a long time, and I think we need solutions sooner rather than later. So do regulators have enough power? And you could compare that to maybe to the EU.
Like, I think a lot of the research has been done, and like whether we've got the perfect formula in terms of the reform of Section 230 or the European Digital Act now, but we've seen a lot of good ideas that I would say are worth consideration by regulators who are maybe only reading into the brief now around internet court. So what does it look if you make this a little bit more collaborative, where the platforms, yes, are having to really look at their responsibilities to the public and the public's responsibilities to them. How do you hold them accountable to them by maybe some independent authorities? What are the penalties? Are there needs for independent courts or others? Like, I would just say that there's a lot of different committees, commissions around the world that have looked at this. There's a lot of research, evidence, ideas there now that people do not have to start from scratch. But I think Mark and I would both say regulation fine, but like not regulation at any cost. Like, it needs to be the right regulation targeted at the right thing that is actually understanding the underlying problems. And I think this is where we need to come back and make sure that all the proposals that are being looked at are really looking at, as Mark talked about, algorithms and the transparency around them, business models. What does it look like to build a little bit more collaboration between platforms and publishers and other ancillary industries, and actually do this in a way that isn't competitive? And yes, you're going to have some nuances country to country, but I would say it needs to be regulation targeted at the right things, starting first and foremost, we would argue, at things that are going to potentially cause real world harm, like disinformation, and making sure you're coming at that problem with the right solutions.
Gotcha. Yeah, briefly just follow up to say, like, we wouldn't ask politicians, elected policymakers, to solve the coronavirus, right? We rely upon medical expertise, the World Health Organization, our own national health authorities. We need to have the same approach for online health. It's the same analogy. So for all due respect to politicians, they should not be in charge of the next regulation. They should definitely be open to the advice of the people who know something about this. And there's a lot of those people about that don't work for platforms. So that's the good news.
Conscious we only have 2 or 3 minutes left. Briefly, obviously, us as citizens, we have a big role to play in this. So what advice would you give to citizens to combat or be conscious of misinformation on a daily basis?
Well, probably two things I would say from the get-go is support your local journalism, national journalism, international journalism, which probably means sometimes paying for it, but sometimes paying for it so that it remains free for others. And I think there's an important principle in there, but probably sometimes sitting back and understanding how is news actually relevant in your daily life. I think sometimes we don't even realize that we're consuming news and information to help inform how we vote, to inform what mortgage we're going to take out. So news is happening all of the time. And sometimes when we better understand that, we'll be prepared to pay for it. So find ways to pay for it, because I worry when you look at the United States, over the last 15 years, we now have news deserts. There's something like 1,800 communities at the start of last year in the United States that has no local newspaper. Now, what does that start to look like if we were to replicate that across Ireland and Europe? Like, I really worry for all of our roles in democracy and informed decision-making if we don't have media institutions that are supported and funded. And then the second thing is then just, practice that critical thinking. Be that person, who checks, who thinks, who asks questions when you get that message, when you see something that just doesn't pass the sniff test. And be that person who's going, right, who, what, where, when, how, why, just asking intelligent, smart questions, going off, checking your sources, seeing other quality newspapers, broadcasters, people that you trust saying something similar, so that you can be that wisdom in the crowd. You can be the person that maybe comes back into the family WhatsApp groups and goes, actually, I call BS on that because I found out X, Y, Z. And there's power in that, and power in all of us feeling a little bit more informed, but taking control at the moment when the world outside just feels so far beyond our control. There's things that we can do. Information, I still believe, and knowledge is power.
And I think I boil it down to 6 words, like be calm, first of all, be curious, second of all, and be kind. What I mean by that is when you see something that feels too good to be true, there's an algorithm that's designed it that way to make you feel some emotion, right? So stop, don't share it. You see something on the Suez Canal and there's some new take on that boat getting stuck, just wait a minute. Be curious, as Áine says, go and look at the background of the people sharing it. Look for the clues. Finally, be kind. If a friend of yours, a relative or a friend does something wrong, don't be a pain in the ass. Don't tell them how wrong they are. You've been there. Be kind. Say, hey, you know what? I almost fell down that rabbit hole, but this is how I pulled myself out. Be the person in the crowd that people gravitate toward. And that'll be the future of the broad campaign against disinformation, is finding people that are just like us, but a little bit smarter when it comes to spotting the stuff we should watch out for. And very kind and supportive of their friends and family. We do not need people nudging us, tapping us on the shoulder right now. We need guides, not people lecturing us. And I think that's one of the biggest things we've found over the last couple of years.
Mark, Áine, it's been an absolute pleasure. I look forward to seeing what Kinzen has in store over the coming years. I know you guys are hiring right now, so scaling massively. So well done on your success to date, and looking forward to seeing where it goes. Thanks very much.
Thanks for your support. Thank you.
Well, we've come to the end of a really informative day. So much content and debate across our 2 stages. I hope you found the sessions insightful and beneficial for your business moving forward. From the elevation stage, that's a wrap. And if you missed any sessions, we'll have on demand for 90 days for you to view from tomorrow. Feel free to share login details with your colleagues to access on-demand content also. We'll also do a full review of the summit and feature some strong pieces from thought leaders in our next issue of the Business and Finance magazine, which is out in May. Make sure to check it out. Again, I'd like to thank our speakers, moderators, exhibitors and events production crew who've worked tirelessly behind the scenes to produce today's summit for you. None of which would have been possible without the support of our partners Explio, Electric Ireland, IBEC, KPMG, National Broadband Ireland, Medis, Skillnet Ireland, Declaran, GeoDirectory, Globalisation Partners, Goodtill by SumUp, Imedis, Interaction, LumiPay, Magnet Networks, Personally Speaking, Sage, Simpro, Cyro and Solace, and our charity partner Suicide or Survive. We're already working on the business show Sustainability for the 22nd of September 2021, featuring Cyril Gutch, who is a global pioneer for sustainability and founder of Parley for the Oceans. For more information on him and our other speakers who will be announced soon, please check out the Business Show Ireland website.